The corridor is long, lit only by the occasional torch sitting in a sconce. Your footsteps echo on the cobblestone floor. Wait, I already did this intro. How's it going, everyone? My name is Ian from Incendium D&D. In a recent video that I made on dungeon crawling, I combined two topics together: designing a dungeon crawl using the spectrum of narrative versus simulation, and how to set up the dungeon crawl on my VTT of choice, Roll20. After receiving some encouraging feedback from you guys, I felt like it might be appropriate to make a new video talking more in depth about the dungeon design and how to run said dungeon online. Although, as I record this, I realize that a lot of the advice in here can really just be applied to any session that you make, dungeon crawl or not, online or not. And of course, as I was writing the script for this video, I discovered more and more how much I actually had to say on the subject. Instead of a few hours, I was spending a few days writing it. And so instead of subjecting you guys to an hour-long video that would take me a week to edit, I figured I could break it up into two key components: pacing and presentation. Also, pardon my voice if it sounds a little sick. I'm a little stuffy today. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about relies on what we've mentioned previously here on the channel. If you haven't seen that video that I just mentioned, or John's video on the narrative versus simulationist spectrum, you should go check those out. It'll give you a lot more context about what I'm going to talk about today. Oh, and when something is online specific, I'll be sure to point it out to you guys. All right, let's get started. When discussing dungeon crawls, a lot of people usually start with how big the dungeon crawl should be. How many rooms? How many levels? What should be inside those rooms? I touched on this in a previous video. Matt Colville has a whole series on running the game where he talks extensively about dungeon crawling at some point. And usually he recommends that you follow the rule of three. 3 levels, 3 areas per level, and 3 rooms per area. That's about 27 rooms, give or take. I've also mentioned that a narrative-focused game ought to be a little bit shorter, at least, than the simulationist-focused game. No matter what your preference is, though, remember that when describing these rooms, less is more. It can be really easy to create descriptions that extensively cover every single detail of the room, but you have to leave something out for the players to discover. And this is actually especially true when preparing for an online session. Because of the change in medium, we have to be more patient and self-disciplined, which is something you'll hear me say a lot, when running our dungeon crawl. Your players don't know what's important and what is just dungeon dressing. We don't want to clutter the board with unnecessary descriptions. Only you have perfect knowledge of the game to be able to distinguish those. As the dungeon master, from time to time, it might feel like it's a good idea to let your players have the reins and take control of the tempo of the game. And if you know your players well and put a lot of trust in them, this very well may be true. But when designing a dungeon crawl, you have to consider that everything you add that the players can interact with will take up more time during the session. It affects the pacing of the adventure. Even in rooms that don't have any combat for them, a single clue can add up to 5 to 10 minutes of dialogue and social interaction between the players and maybe NPCs as well. So, assuming we have 27 rooms and we've got about 5 to 10 minutes per room, per detail, that's 270 minutes, over 4 hours at least. And of course, that would be monotonous and stagnant. No one wants to play, ooh, a piece of candy.
Piece of candy.
Every time they come into the room for 4 hours. They want excitement, tension, and resolution. And that requires a good understanding of pacing. I'm going to talk more about pacing in just a second here, but there are some other elements we also need to consider: character actions, combat, and resting. I've said that dungeon crawls require self-discipline, and this is true of both the DM and the players. Letting the players move their tokens across the board all willy-nilly will deflate the tension that you have prepared for them. Instead, have them place their tokens, describe their action, and tell them how it resolves. Simple. Combat takes the most time out of a D&D session, so you're going to want to season your dungeon crawl carefully with it. Too much combat can make things feel like they're dragging on. Not enough combat can make it feel like there are no stakes or real consequences to their presence in the dungeon. And waiting for combat to conclude can be really exhausting. This is especially important in an online dungeon crawl, where your players will be staring at their screen for hours at a time already. Compare this to the energy at the table, where players can easily bounce off each other and get excited about what each character is doing. As a rule of thumb, I've found success in having one combat per 1 to 3 scenes of social interaction, exploration, and just characters hanging out with each other. Lastly, there's resting. When is it appropriate for you to let the player characters rest? Well, in a dungeon crawl, I'd say rarely. A long rest is 8 hours by rules as written, and expecting the dungeon to just wait on the players to get up to full health and restore all their resources is just unrealistic and not very compelling, even if you are more concerned about presenting a narrative than a simulation. In fact, I'd say especially so. If anything, short rests are the way to go. You want your players to feel like they're using their resources and managing them to the best of their ability. They have to be careful. The dungeon is trying to kill them after all. Of course, this means that combat will need to push them to use these resources, even if it's just a little bit at a time. So with that overview out of the way, here's what I recommend. Take a look at this graph.
Look at this graph!
No, not that one. This one. This is a plot diagram. You may recognize it from literature classes in grade school. It depicts the narrative flow of any cohesive story. It includes exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution, or denouement. And if you think about it, many D&D sessions follow this structure carefully. The party learns of a quest to kill a monster. They set out to track it down and encounter obstacles along the way, raising the stakes. They finally locate it and have the boss fight. The party defeats the monster and collects their reward, loose ends are tied up, and everybody goes home. This graph is exactly how I design my D&D sessions today. When creating strong pacing for a dungeon crawl, your rooms and the design you have for your dungeon should reflect these 5 core elements of creative writing. Let's start with exposition. This is basically the party discovering the dungeon from the outside or getting a quest compelling them to go and explore it. You should give them hints about the dungeon's origins or what may lay deeper inside. Have 3 to 4 bullet points describing what's inside each room. A handful of rooms like this will pique their interest and compel them to move forward to sate their curiosity. This is a good time to inject some combat into the situation if you're so inclined. But I do recommend keeping it short and sweet. If you're not as interested in creating combat encounters, another way to go about this is designing traps. The traps give the party exposition as to what kind of creatures lay in wait in the dungeon. If it's an underground ruin, the denizens might be troglodytes who use basic pitfalls or blade traps. A wizard's tower, however, may have magical runes that detonate when walked on, and probably something to alert the wizard to the party's presence. There are all sorts of traps online for dungeon crawls that people have designed, ranging in complexity and lethality. I recommend going and checking those out for yourself. Rising action should begin in the 3rd or 4th room. Now's the time to make your party react to their surroundings, and this might be where you introduce the infamous T intersection. They have to make a choice now. Should they go left or right? Obviously, you don't need to make it a literal T intersection. The players just need to make a significant choice, one that will change how they move throughout the rest of the dungeon. And they might try to weasel out of it somehow. After all, there's no quick saving in D&D, and the players will be wondering, what if we had gone this way instead of that way? A great way to spice up your rising action is actually, in my opinion, to split the party, even though everybody always advises against that.
Oh, hold on, I dropped my pen!
I think it's a really good way to increase the dramatic tension, especially if you're going to start introducing combat where you have 2 halves of the party dealing with 2 separate combats. Of course, this isn't just combat for combat's sake. We're not just trying to kill the players here. The combat should result in the party learning more about the dungeon and finding clues or MacGuffins that will help them later on. And when they find each other again, they have to put these things together in order to proceed. Splitting the party isn't necessary, however, and if you're uncomfortable trying to juggle two different combats at the same time, or cut back and forth between two different parts of the party, then you can feel free to avoid this. In fact, I think there's a skillful way to splitting the party that we could definitely make a video on in the future, so keep your eye out for that. When designing the rising action of your dungeon, you also need to consider what kind of loot system you want to have in place. Is it spread out evenly throughout the dungeon, or is it all hoarded inside the boss room? What kind of loot is it? Is it just jewels and gold, or are there magic items as well? And for that matter, what's the rarity of this kind of loot in your world? These are just some example questions. You don't have to answer all of them, but it is important to consider because it will convey a different tone in your dungeon crawl depending on what you choose. Loot that is pre-generated or set out for them in advance will encourage the player's ingenuity in how they use that loot. Randomly generated loot, the kind you roll for on the DMG loot tables, will convey more surprise and excitement because nobody, not even you as the DM, knows exactly what the party is going to find. Of course, then you have to kind of consider things about like if you have an economy for magic items and how much each magic item would be worth and what kind of rarity, and it's a lot to think about. No matter what, just figure out what your players like best and incorporate that into your dungeon. Personally, I actually kind of like the way Legend of Zelda handles this. They have pre-generated loot throughout the dungeon, except for like breaking pots and getting rupees. And usually the treasure that Link finds is something that's going to help him navigate the dungeon better or defeat the boss more easily. It can be really satisfying for the players to make it to the final room and discover that the Omphalos, that's this, that they picked up along the way used to contain the BBEG they're taking on. Now you've reached the peak of the dungeon crawl. The players have been making their way carefully through the dungeon, learning more about its denizens and maybe the final boss along the way. This information doesn't have to be direct, however. In fact, I think it's best if it's a mix of implicit information and explicit information, a blend of subtle and vague information with obvious and clear stuff. You want your players to have a few key questions about what's going on in this place, but not so much that they feel they have no understanding whatsoever. Most of all, you want them to have clear motivations for completing the dungeon crawl and not just turning around. There should be clear in-character and out-of-character reasons for them to want to finish the session. And once you achieve this, it's time for the final fight of the dungeon crawl, the boss battle.
With something like that, I would have white wine, I think.
The gameplay of the boss fight should be determined by what kind of role the creature plays in combat, which is something that my co-creator John has helped me to figure out. The skirmisher, the brute, or the bruiser. These terms come from 4th edition, which was controversial at best, and there's a lot more that goes into it than what I'm going to talk about here. In fact, there's so much to talk about, I think I'll leave that up to a future video. But these terms do give us some value to design our encounters with. For now, let's just summarize. The skirmisher is the high damage, low survivability kind of creature, so adding a few minions will give them a buffer that allows them to really challenge the players and pose a significant threat to them. Brutes are tanky solo creatures, and they're going to need a robust action economy in order to keep things interesting. Lastly, you've got the bruiser, who can both take a hit and dish out the damage. Combining this kind of creature with a supporting ally, such as a mage, will really make things difficult for the players. They'll have to decide whether it's better to try and finish the fight early by attacking the bruiser or take out its supporting mage that's increasing its power exponentially. Whatever kind of boss you have planned, all the tension that you've built up in the dungeon up to this point should culminate in this fight. And that brings us to falling action and the denouement, or resolution. As you can see on the graph, this is a much steeper angle than the rising action. This used to bug the hell out of me as a student, because I always thought it was necessary to have rising action and falling action be equally long and convoluted. But that's not true. In fact, Falling action should be much shorter and more concise than the rising action that built up to it, because otherwise it's just going to drag on forever. Loose ends need to be tied up quickly and succinctly. Once the boss fight is over, help the players answer lingering questions they may still have. This doesn't mean you just give them the answers outright in a metagame sort of fashion. You want them to draw their own conclusions based on the clues that you've laid out. In fact, you can remind them of those clues if they've forgotten. If there's a deeper meaning to the dungeon crawl or a larger plot at play, these conclusions might actually just be necessary to make. It's also a really good opportunity for characters to have some more interactions before the session concludes. Maybe high-fiving each other or patting each other on the back, or expressing sympathy and empathy for something that may have happened during the fight. As a player that plays online regularly and through text-based gameplay, I'd like to point out that the denouement is a unique opportunity to create short fiction of what happened during the session. Recounting the events of the session in a narrative form lets the players see their character on the big screen, so to speak, and can get them really excited for the next one, or even just remind them next time of what happened in the last session. If you're the creative writing type, I recommend you give this a try. And that's it. That's all I have to say about pacing for dungeon crawls. What do you think? Did I have any good points in there, or was I completely off the mark? I hope this gave you something to think about today. Talking about dungeon crawls in this context is kind of nice because a lot of the advice that I'm giving can really just be applied to any of your sessions. And honestly, I was kind of worried about how I was going to talk about the subject as a whole. I honestly thought that online was going to be a more significant factor than it actually is. But the more I wrote, the more I realized that I had kind of misframed the last video I had done on the subject. There are definitely challenges to running a game online, many that I've covered in a previous video. But dungeon crawling as a whole is actually fairly consistent at the table, and how your players react to it still primarily depends on you as the DM and how you run it. Pacing is the key to unlocking tension and resolution in your dungeon crawl. But there's still the matter of enhancing immersion and suspending the player's disbelief in the game. And that requires a lot more knowledge about presentation, which we're going to be talking about next time. If you enjoyed this video, let YouTube know. Press like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell. It really means a lot to us. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll catch you guys next time.